All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. This is a short form. Ian writes, I'm interested in seeing if you can go in depth in short form and expand upon C.S. Lewis's idea of intent found in his book, The Screwtape Letters, as it would be a good way to classify general observational statements of the world as opposed to having it focus on laughter, i.e. joy, play, the joke proper, flippancy. So, I love this question. This is my favorite C.S. Lewis book, and it's my favorite section of my favorite C.S. Lewis book. I apologize in advance because I am going to talk a lot about the laughter part, even though this question is asking really to take this breakdown beyond the laughter. But I think the best way to do that begins with the exploration of the laughter point. So, some initial bookkeeping here, and I can already tell this is going to go on much longer than 15 minutes because I have a long quote I would like to read from Screwtape Letters. But there is some initial bookkeeping here, or not bookkeeping, a philosophical meta point about sources here. C.S. Lewis, for those of you who don't know, is a Christian author. I am not a Christian. I have written a whole book against Christianity, which you can read online for free or find on Amazon if you'd like. Holy Nihilism, the Moral and Spiritual Case Against Christianity. However, I am a big C.S. Lewis fan. I think C.S. Lewis is a fantastic writer, and I believe that people miss out tremendously when they dismiss authors or thinkers just because they take a position opposite to your own. So, and of all of the C.S. Lewis books out there, Screwtape Letters is one of those ones that I would highly recommend even to non-Christians, because the psychological insights there in Screwtape Letters are so good, and not just good but useful. I first read the Screwtape Letters all the way through. I think I'd read bits and pieces before, but all the way through on my honeymoon of all times in October of 2016, and it's a good honeymoon read. It's not like an upbeat one. It's kind of a dark book, but for setting your relationship on a good path, and as far as like bringing both you and your spouse into awareness of these kind of pitfalls that Lewis is describing, it's really good. For those of you who don't know, The Screwtape Letters is a book written from the perspective of an older demon to a younger demon that he is kind of mentoring, trying to help this younger demon waylay and lead mortals into sin and away from salvation. It's very much a if I were the devil kind of genre of book, but with emphasis on the subtle things. And it's very masterfully done. So allow me, without further ado, to read at some length the section that he lists on laughter. This is Screwtape writing. You speak of there being great laughers. I trust this does not mean that you are under the impression that laughter as such is always in our favor. The point is worth some attention. I divide the causes of human laughter into joy, fun, the joke proper, and flippancy. I'm going to jump a little bit because basically what he says is that joy and fun are not very useful to the demons. But then he says, but the joke proper we can make use of. And he says some things about how, the value of the joke is not in its bawdishness and its tendency toward sexuality necessarily, but rather, quote, the real use of jokes or humor is in quite a different direction, and it is specially promising among the English, who take their sense of humor so seriously that a deficiency in this sense is almost the only deficiency at which they feel shame. Humor, for them, the all-consoling and, mark this, the all-excusing grace of life. Hence, it is invaluable as a means of destroying shame. If a man simply lets others pay for him, he is mean. if he boasts of it in a jocular manner, and twits his fellows with having been scored off, he is no longer mean, but a comical fellow. Mere cowardice is shameful. Cowardice boasted of with humorous exaggerations and grotesque gestures can be passed off as funny. Cruelty is shameful, unless the cruel man can represent it as a practical joke. 1,000 bawdy or even blasphemous jokes do not help toward a man's damnation so much as his discovery that almost anything he wants to do can be done not only without the disapproval, but with the admiration of his fellows, if only it can get itself treated as a joke. And this temptation can be almost entirely hidden from your patient by that English seriousness about humor. Any suggestion that there might be too much of it can be represented to him as puritanical, or as betraying a lack of humor. But, and here's the good part, but flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it is very economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it. But every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, the habit of flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor plating against the enemy, that's God, that I know, and it is quite free from the dangers inherent in the other sources of laughter. It is 1,000 miles away from joy. It deadens instead of sharpening the intellect, and it excites no affection between those who practice it. End quote. So, again, I read this fully through for the first time back in 2016, but even then, like, the humor part stuck out to me, and resonated with me. I had a little bit before then, actually, been introduced to Jack Donovan and his work. You might have heard some of my conversations with him over on the Pater Order Fire channel. And Jack Donovan back in, I want to say 2013 or so, 2014, maybe a little bit later than that. It must have been later than that. Was talking about the possibility of becoming rebels of sincerity against hipster culture, which had been discussed at some great length by who's the author of Infinite Jest? The name will come to me. David Foster Wallace. There we go. And how irony and insincerity, which is a very close cousin of flippancy, were killing our culture because it kills everything in exactly the manner that C.S. Lewis describes. And again, while C.S. Lewis points this out very well and very, very precisely and accurately and perfectly within a Christian context, it's not just a Christian observation. Ayn Rand made a very, very strong atheist, made a very similar observation in The Fountainhead, in the character of Ellsworth Toohey, who's the kind of the antagonist who at one point in the story makes a point about jokes and he uses jokes in a very destructive manner. And as you might have guessed by the cover image I chose here, another non-Christian, a pagan, in fact, that is Alan Moore, not just a pagan, but an occultist, depicted this same evil tendency of comedy in some of his characters, namely the comedian in Watchmen, and perhaps some of you might know this character named the Joker from the Batman, specifically Alan Moore's depiction in The Killing Joke, which was his short animated film. I think it was a graphic novel first. That was the primary inspiration for Heath Ledger's portrayal in The Dark Knight and so forth. But there's a nihilism latent in Alan Moore's view of comedy taken to the extreme. There's a nihilism behind the instinct that seeks to find humor in everything and find everything funny. It's a maniacal evil thing in the form of the Joker, and it's just a kind of sad, depressing thing in the case of the comedian, although he's also can be pretty vicious at times. Just, it's a joke. It's all just an existential joke, you know. And this goes back quite far. You can find the spirit all the way back in, I get to bring this up in 2 videos, the Iliad. We have this character in book 2 named Thersites. You might have heard me mention him before. He gets like 2 paragraphs, a lot more in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. But he is the embodiment of this nihilistic comedic railer that Karl Marx became enamored with. Everything is funny. Everything is worth mocking. And it comes from a place of resentment. It comes from a place of hostility and a desire to destroy everything. But, and this kind of goes back to the C.S. Lewis point, it doesn't always begin with that intention. What's interesting, while people who are resentful and hateful and tarantulas, as Nietzsche would describe them, secretly vengeful, the habit can begin quite innocuously. What C.S. Lewis describes is a gradual transformation, a process by which someone, through habituating themselves to certain kinds of behaviors, actually adopts this intentionality into themselves by their actions. And that's the danger that C.S. Lewis is trying to highlight here. I think the most tragic example from contemporary times that people might be familiar with is George Carlin. George Carlin, of course, is a classic comedian, but was so good at pointing out and finding hypocrisies that he was able to find them everywhere. And in his later years, his comedy acts weren't even comedy anymore. They were just railing against everything. It was kind of just sad to watch. So there's this corrosive spirit, and I will how do I want to do this? I think I'm going to bring Nietzsche into this a little bit more, because there's a very interesting crossover between Nietzsche and Lewis here. I think both of them would in very broad general strokes agree with this. We can break down not just the intention, but the effects upon intention of certain kinds of actions into 2 sort of spiritual trajectories. On the one hand, we have resentment. That's what the demons are trying to foster in Screwtape Letters. And on the other hand, you have something like gratitude. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche describes the healthy person as not tending towards philosophy, because that's the instinct of unhealthy people, but occasionally philosophizing out of a kind of overflowing of health and as an expression of gratitude that must inscribe itself in capital letters upon the clouds, or something poetic like that. It's a spirit of graciousness and gratitude, and that is also what C.S. Lewis is advocating, although from a different theological framework. But the binary is the same. But the point is not, there is a danger in focusing, like I said before, too much upon the actual mentality, the actual motivation behind it, because again, the actions themselves can foster that spirit, that intentionality over time. So, how do we distinguish this? Well, I think not just in laughter, but in things generally, and it's worth maybe pointing out another example of how we might find this in another dimension. The best example that comes to mind is justice. Justice is a great one. There is a spirit of justice that comes from a desire to keep things ordered and good. We have to maintain an order out of a love of a place and a desire to keep it beautiful and good. People who live in not quite my home city, but close to my home city, which is Seattle, might be feeling a little bit despairing right now, because that city is not in a good place, to put it mildly. And, so there's a lot of crime, specifically crime in relation to vagrancy, drug use, property crime. Not that much violent crime yet, but a lot of just stuff that is making the city unlivable, And you're watching this city that you maybe love, because there's a lot to love about Seattle, die. So one could advocate justice and we've got to do something about the drugs. We've got to do something about the property crime, the fentanyl, the heroin. Got to do something about the bed bugs too, cockroaches, the rats, the Norway rats, not good, especially on Alki. You've got to do. We've got to do something, and justice is a tool, right? But there's another spirit in which one might be advocating justice, and that's just vengeance. And I actually think when you go back to the origins of the concept of justice, back in ancient Greece, justice was actually synonymous with vengeance. There is no semantic distinction between the two, and so justice was not invoked lightly in those days, and was not something that you hoped for necessarily. You would be like, I fear the justice of Zeus, so we're gonna do good things to avoid invoking justice, because that causes problems for everybody. We don't want to go there. That's the blood feud, Nowadays we speak of justice as something benevolent, as something kind, almost, as something with good intentions, we might say. But and that's also a legitimate usage of this term, but it can be used in different ways, and people can invoke the term, the idea, coming from completely different places, just as people can invoke laughter in different manners. And maybe the worst expression of this is what we see in anarcho-tyranny. That's when we see both at the same time. Anarcho-tyranny is the state in which there are laws that basically make everything criminal, and everyone is a criminal. However, only the enemies of those in power get prosecuted. So the law is selectively applied, but it holds everybody like sinners in the hands of an angry God over the pits of eternal prison and lawfare forever, depending on whether or not you are friends with those in power. So the point here is to not recognize intention, but even harder than that, to recognize the trajectory upon which certain actions will lead the human soul over time. This is extremely not easy. This is extremely difficult. It requires lots of experience interacting with people, and not just experience interacting with people, but also serious introspection and empathy. But it's very valuable. It's a skill that was refined by C.S. Lewis, and almost to an art form by Friedrich Nietzsche. But maybe the best person to look to for this is not even C.S. Lewis or Nietzsche. It's someone I don't necessarily talk about that much. He's talked about a great deal by other people elsewhere, and they do good work with him. But that's Carl Jung. Carl Jung had this idea of the shadow, which is are these elements of ourselves that we are not necessarily aware of, and or parts of ourselves that, because we're kind of afraid of them for moral reasons perhaps, we kind of push them down and sweep them under the rug of our conscious awareness. One of the things that both Nietzsche and Lewis focus upon are the hidden motives. Not just hidden from the public, like I'm hiding my secret intentions here, but oftentimes hidden even to the people themselves. And it's one of Screwtape's strategies to play upon these motivations that his unwitting subjects aren't even aware of, in order to lead them closer to damnation and away from salvation. And so, perhaps a key to moving away from the frame of resentment and towards the frame of graciousness and gratitude is acknowledging these darker parts of ourselves, what Carl Jung might call integrating the shadow, and not hiding from or shying away from the darker parts of human nature, so that they can be met head on. Be like, why am I wanting to find something contradictory and funny about this? Why? Because if comedy can, and it can, if you are sufficiently verbally talented, you can make anything funny. You can, if there isn't a contradiction, you can invent one. Because contradictions all come down to, largely, how do we phrase a thing? I can phrase anything I want into something that makes it seem self-contradictory. This is very easy. It's actually very easy to do with a little bit of practice. But if comedy is to be some kind of social commentary, if it's to have any kind of social use, it can only have that use, if sometimes it looks at something and finds no contradiction. And the best example I've seen recently of this was there was a game show, like Last Comedian Standing or something, where of all people, Norm Macdonald was on the panel, and some would-be comedian went up to do his bit, and he decided to make some jokes at the expense of the Bible. And he said, oh, if you can quote passages from your favorite book as if that's some kind of authority, why can't I quote passages from my favorite book? Man does not live on bread alone. Well, there's a little bit of magic in everybody. Harry Potter chapter 7. Cue audience seal applause. Yeah, it's so funny. And he says, one of these books is about someone sacrificing themselves to save the world from the forces of evil. And the other one is the Bible. And, more applause, lame clapping, and the panel is like, wow, that was pretty brave to go after the Bible. And then Norm Macdonald says, I don't think it was that brave. I think if you're going to go after a world religion like that, you should at least know what you're talking about. To my knowledge, Norm Macdonald wasn't a Christian. I could be wrong. But he then said, it's a well-known fact that J.K. Rowling is a Christian. And she famously said that if anyone was familiar with the scriptures, they would be able to predict the ending of book 7. Exactly what happened. In other words, Harry Potter is a Christ figure. And saying, criticizing the Bible as somehow inferior to Harry Potter is its own kind of joke, if you understand the humor in contradictions of this and absurdities of this kind. So there's some utility of humor there, and maybe Norm Macdonald saw the humor there, although he wasn't laughing when he made the point. But I think that there isn't really a better way to explain the dynamic and guide people on this path other than to just prime people to be aware of, the two paths that these different spirits can take you, and that these different actions, which the actions themselves have their own spirit in them, can take you. And what kind of person do you want to be? If you are going to make fun of people, do so very carefully. If you are going to endlessly mock and criticize people, be mindful of, as Heraclitus says, what that will turn you into. Be careful chasing monsters, lest you yourself become one, to borrow another Nietzscheanism. So, apologies for not expanding too far beyond the comedy front, but I do think it's the best example of that. Let me see if I can list a couple more examples real quick. Art, and pornography. Let's talk about that for a second. There is obviously so it is a famously difficult line to draw between erotic art and pornography. There's no rule you can point to. It defies rules in the same way that comedy defies easy definition or rules. You know it by the intention that you sense in the speaker if you are mentally connected with them. In the same way, you can get a sensation of the intention of pornography. Some art is not meant to merely appreciate the human form, if you know what I mean. Now, there are works of art that are erotic, that are not meant to get people off. If you look at a Odin sculpture, for example, like lovers or the embrace, things like that, this is very erotic. It is, but it's not pornography. Conversely, there is pornography that's non-nude, but you can sense in your body the more viscerally than in maybe other cases like comedy, if you're a man, the intention of the artwork by the effect. I'll bring up a Scott Adamsism, which I think is a broader engineering term here too, but the effect is the intent. And there's an asterisk there. There's an asterisk to this rule, which is, the effect is the intent if nothing is changed over time. As in, if you have a system or a behavior that is achieving the same results and no one's changing anything, then it is doing the thing that the people intended it to do. And this can sometimes be a very dark diagnosis for people who are doing somewhat self-destructive behaviors. I'll bring up a particularly sad example just because it's been at the front of my mind for the last month or so. I've been on a bit of a Alice in Chains bender. I've come to believe that Lane Staley's death in, was it 2006? Yeah, 2006, 2004. I don't remember. The early 2000s was a long tail suicide. It was not merely addiction. I believe he wanted to kill himself. Now, addiction complicates this a little bit. It's based on with some nuance on things he said to their old bassist the day prior, and personal things that happened in his life and other things like that. But like sometimes people are doing self-destructive things because that's what they want. And you have to, when you face that in yourself, I'll give a personal example, actually. Many years ago, I used to smile like this. I think I can still do it. Like a smirk, that asymmetrical smile. And I was told by an uncle one time, I don't smile like that anymore. I haven't for years. But this is because I was told by an uncle, hey, you need to fix your smile. And, in my head, I'm like, how do you fix a smile? It's just what it is. But if you read the writings of someone like Paul Ekman, an expert from the University of Washington on microexpressions. Am I remembering the correct person? Lie to me, guy. American psychologist professor. Yes, yes. Paul Ekman. I'm remembering that correctly. The micro expressions guy. According to Paul Ekman, that asymmetrical smile is contempt and a sign of contempt. And I had to face the fact that the reason my default smile was a smirk was because I actually was feeling contempt. And I didn't know that. This was news to me, but it was still there. And when I addressed the emotional sources and causes of that, my smile changed all on its own. And now I smile like a normal person. So, the point, I guess, is that our behaviors and our inner spirit kind of interact with each other mutually and reciprocally. They can feed into each other. And the whole point of the demon like screwtape is to try to get you on a downward spiral, a downward snowball and a feedback loop of negativity. But if you can recognize the signs and you can recognize the activities that tend toward that downward trajectory, then you can consciously intercede and interject and stop the cycle and be like, hey, I'm not going to do a bunch of flippancy. I'm not going to jump on justice bandwagons when this all feels like it's about revenge and not justice. I'm not going to embrace some institution that's asking for money. I'm not going to support them financially. They're like supporting the arts, and it's like, is this about supporting the arts? Or all the art I'm seeing is right on the edge and seems to be pushing things more towards just more overt sexuality that is maybe not healthy in public. So it takes experience and introspection and empathy. But I think the most useful binary frame to look at is, is the effect of this action an expression of gratitude, or is the effect of this action motivated by resentment? And even overt sexuality is often motivated by a desire to subvert social norms. It is resentment and spite against oppressive rules. That is often where that's coming from. And the same is true, obviously, of vengeance motivated justice, and of comedy that is more flippant than it is like truly finding real contradictions in the world rather than just inventing them. So this went a little bit longer than a short form video, but I hope that was useful. It's a big subject and is, I think, worth going over a little bit. So thanks so much for watching. Hope you found this entertaining and useful and perhaps informative. Take care.